When you talk about getting permission from all the surrounding nature's consent before using natural land, do you have an idea of what that might look like? I know you talked about getting permission from the rivers and the rocks and the people in the area. Maybe you could expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, so first I would say that when I talk about like giving environmental entities representatives, a lot of the research I looked at, it could mean either people that live by those surrounding environments, or they're like environmental activist groups or something like that, or environmental lawyers. I would say that those people would be the ones, but at the same time, I think that there's an importance in actually listening to the environment. Like, should we do something to a river, for example? If we look at like the science of like, is this safe for the river? Then maybe we shouldn't do it. Like, yeah, we should be using people as the representative, because if the environment is considered a person, then we should be listening to it as if it's a person. And while it can't use actual words, there's a way that we can just like, receive the signals it's giving us.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just finished reading mine, and so I'm thinking about how corporations, how they get their representation, or how we listen to corporations. We take the ideas of the people who make up the corporation and then use that as its consent. So it totally makes sense of how you could do that for the environment, how the signals are clear. What are your ideas of how a corporation/human interest should be weighed against an environmental one?
Well, that's really tricky, because if we're talking about in the court of law, like there's some sort of case happening between a corporation and an environmental entity represented by someone, in terms of the money, it's probably going to be like, the corporation will be able to afford better lawyers. They'll be able to afford going through a whole trial, whereas the environment might have to settle or something like that. If we consider the environment to be a person, then maybe that's something that we would look into, is governmentally giving this river or this mountain should have better legal representation, then it would be funded better that way. But other than money, I don't know how it would work out. Like with corporations, it's very easy. A person can just be like, I run this company, or I'm on the board. This is what should happen. But with an environment, I don't know how they could best represent themselves. So how would we treat it differently? How would we look at it differently? I think if we give it personhood in terms of we value its opinion just as much as we would value the personhood of a corporation, then hopefully we treat it better. So
Totally see that. Yeah, there's not a concrete limit. Like you said, money totally throws everything out of balance when trying to weigh the interest of both of them. And if there was a way to take money out of the factor, maybe. Last question. Do you see any feasible way of how this could be incorporated in today's society? What would it take? What would it look like? Just your thoughts.
So that exact question is kind of where I want my research to go. Like, how would this happen? How could you change the public opinion to being all for it? How could you make it reflect from the corporations or people law, which is kind of what I feel like would happen. Like, we would look at Citizens United and all these other cases which have said for this reason and this reason and this reason, corporations are considered people, and just look at how similar it can be applied to almost anything. And if we value the environment so much and we value protecting it, considering it a person just gives it that much more leverage. It gives it that much more representation. It could be treated more as equals, because right now, if people, associations, churches, businesses, like they're all considered people, they have that much more leg up in the court. So I don't know. I think a lot of it would involve people changing and thinking of the world as not just revolving around humans. Like, some random ecosystem will matter just as much as we do, if not more, or in different ways. So it would involve that. And I think it would also involve just looking at what other things we consider to be persons. And if it applies, and if it doesn't, then why doesn't it? Maybe we should change those reasons that those things are people.
Looking at the boundaries and comparing and contrasting them to how we could apply them to the environment sounds like what you're. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. And that is a good segue into my research. I'll conclude with incorporating mine into what you're saying about how we should compare the existing boundaries we have so we can better get an idea of how we could give the environment some legal standing. We would use the environment. It's not a person. It's a legal. We would use it as a legal fiction. Has no form.
Mm.
Its controlling mind would be the people that make up the environment. So people in the surrounding area, like you said, the rivers, rocks, having somebody to represent those. I'm just reading a quote from mine. It's an artifact of a particular place. That's what gives it its jurisdiction and its good nature. Obviously, good nature, because we can't survive without nature. I think another important point is, rather than granting legal standing to all nature as one entity, it makes sense to break it down into categories like this mountain, this lake.
That's an interesting idea. Like if we could separate it by like animal and animal type, whether it's like mountain or like the atmosphere or something like that. I think that's interesting, having different categories of how much of a person it is and what legal rights or responsibilities it would have if it is.
Okay. I say that just because of one of the researchers I found, they talked about how animals have somewhat of legal standing in cases.
Yeah, heard of that.
Yeah, not specific animals, just the species. They don't want to go too narrow, I guess, because then it just makes it more complicated. But by species, it's able to protect this specific interest for whatever reason. The last thing I'll say, I think some more boundaries that we should take into consideration when giving nature personhood would be, by the article's account, these include a higher order animals resembling more human characteristics, respect and recognition of the moral agency of animals, their physical appearance, their lack of cognitive agency and awareness, their ability to realistically exercise their rights, not just on paper. These criteria are a baseline that should be tested against scenarios involving non-living human entities.
Yeah, that was another thing I was thinking about, because like when it comes to animals, like they have like autonomy and they know what they're doing and they're thinking and they're aware of their life and everything they do, they're making choices. But when it comes to the environment, like it's more of like a system or process or something that's happening. Like it is kind of autonomous. Like a river will continue to flow and a mountain will continue to grow things and be a place for like bugs to grow up or something like that. But it's not like thinking itself. Like, oh, I'm going to be doing this. It just kind of happens. So it's interesting if that would be considered like a person sort of thing to do, to be able to have its own process or system of thing that it's doing. Like an ecosystem has a purpose, it has something it's doing, like, but it's not exactly thinking about it necessarily that we know of. So does that consider a different level of personhood? That is definitely something that's really interesting to think about.
Yeah, I I think you nailed it. That's a great answer to their cognitive awareness and their moral agency. Is, it sounds like their goal. I mean, not all the times, forest fires, but
Yeah.
they're trying to preserve their ecosystem, just like we're trying to preserve our life, our way of life. Corporations are trying to preserve their interest, animals, their uh, what, food supply or something.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because our decisions could like change or completely stop its process. So does that like stop its life? Like, yeah, it's interesting.
well, I think that concludes the interview, Isabel.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a
Not a
good
problem. Have a great Halloween.
Oh yeah, you too.